Hey guys, picture this. You're trudging through a thunder-rattled steppe, the cold wind whipping your face while a herd of 10,000 horse snorting nomads erupts like a living wall of dust and leather-smelling sweat. Yeah, the Mongol Empire's version of rush hour, and trust me, you'd never get a parking spot. Before we dive into how these steppe rebels built the biggest empire the world's ever seen, smash that like button if you love a good underdog story, and drop a comment telling us which modern mega corporation you think would survive a Genghis-style takeover. Dim the lights, grab a coffee, or a cup of fermented mare's milk if you're feeling adventurous, and get ready to feel the thump of war drums echoing louder than your neighbor's Bluetooth speaker at 2 a.m. You'll soon discover that Nomad wasn't just an Instagram hashtag. It was a ruthless logistics network that moved faster than today's Amazon Prime, with yurt-to-yurt couriers delivering orders of arrows, loot, and gossip. Think of it like a startup that grew from a garage to a global monopoly overnight, except the garage was a cold plane, and the IPO involved the occasional scalp taking. So, are you ready to ride the wind of history and see how a handful of horse-armed rebels turned the world into their own backyard? Let's roll. The Mongolian plateau stretches like a golden sea, its grasses whispering secrets to the relentless wind. In the middle of this wind-tossed arena, a lanky shepherd named Temujin tends his flock, his boots caked in the earthy scent of yak dung and horse sweat. Every sunrise paints the horizon in blood-red hues, a reminder that the steppe never sleeps. Children chase after runaway goats, their laughter echoing like distant drums, while the sky above swirls with clouds that look suspiciously like a dragon's breath. Even the air feels charged, as if the very atmosphere is waiting for a story to explode into legend. One scorching afternoon, Temujin gathers the heads of rival clans around a cracked stone cairn, each leader clutching a blood-stained yak-hide banner. He slams his palm on the ground, and the earth shudders, sending a puff of dust into the eyes of the skeptics, like a low-budget special effect in a medieval action flick. "We are wolves," he snarls, but wolves hunt in packs, not solo. The chieftains exchange wary glances, their beards twitching like nervous cats, before they each raise a ceremonial cup of fermented mare's milk and swear an oath that smells faintly of fermented funk and ambition. The pact seals with a thunderclap that seems to say, "Game on, history," and the steppe erupts in a chorus of hooves and hopeful howls. Amid the revelry, the old shaman Bert Khatan steps forward, her eyes clouded with incense smoke that smells like burnt sage and goat cheese. She lifts a cracked crystal, and the light flickers across her weather-worn face, revealing a grin that could outsmile a Cheshire cat. "Your destiny stretches beyond the horizon," she intones, her voice rolling like a distant thunderstorm, "and the world will hear your name before the next winter's snow melts." The clan leaders stare, half in awe, half wondering if she just invented a new brand of motivational speaking. Bert Khatan chuckles, tapping the crystal like a DJ scratching a record, and whispers, "Just don't forget to bring snacks for the long road ahead." With the shaman's prophecy hanging in the air like a scented incense stick, the newly forged coalition begins its training on the open steppe. Young warriors practice archery, their arrows whistling through the grass, occasionally missing and embedding themselves in unsuspecting goat backs, much to the animals' chagrin. They ride horses that snort and sweat like nervous teenagers on a first date, the scent of leather and horsehair mingling with the ever-present bite of pine. Nights are spent around blazing fires, where stories are swapped, jokes are cracked about who can eat the most fermented milk without puking, and someone inevitably compares Temujin to a teenage superhero who just discovered his powers. By sunrise, the clan's banners flutter like giant, slightly tattered Instagram stories, announcing to the world that a new force is gathering. As the sun dips low, casting long shadows that look like the fingers of an impatient god, the coalition stands shoulder to shoulder, ready to march beyond the steppes' familiar confines. The wind carries the faint scent of distant cities, spices, smoke, and the promise of conquest, mixing with the earthy musk of the plains. Temujin lifts his sword, its blade catching the dying light, and grins like a kid who just found the cheat code for life. "Let the world think we're just a bunch of nomads with bad hair," he declares, his voice echoing across the valley, "but we'll rewrite history faster than a binge-watch marathon." The steppe, ever the silent witness, rustles approvingly, as if to say, "Showtime, boys, let's make some noise." When Temujin finally earned the thunderous title of Genghis Khan, he didn't just get a flashier name tag. He turned a chaotic chorus of tribal warbands into a disciplined orchestra called the Tumen, each unit a neat 10,000 strong. He gathered the chieftains around a crackling fire, the smoke smelling of yak dung and fresh pine, and barked orders louder than a steppe thunderclap. Suddenly, the loose shooting archers fell into step, their horses' hooves thudding in unison like a drumline on a war march. The new formation felt as tight as a well-knotted rope, ready to snap any enemy's resolve. Even the wind seemed to whisper, "Whoa, that's some serious organization for a bunch of nomads." Next came the Yasa, Genghis's legal code, which he rolled out like a medieval version of a smartphone update, mandatory, swift, and a little bewildering. It banned stealing a neighbor's yurt, demanded that you share your fermented mare's milk, and even prescribed the proper way to tie a horse's saddle, because nothing kills morale faster than a squeaky saddle. The law was etched on wooden tablets, the scent of fresh ink mixing with the earthy musk of the camp, and the warriors listened, half in awe, half in fear of the looming consequences. Genghis laughed, saying the Yasa was the original user agreement, read it or get a spear in the back. The code cemented order, turning raw ferocity into a disciplined, almost bureaucratic killing machine. With the Yasa binding them, the Mongol horse archers became the steppe's equivalent of a high-speed internet, fast, ubiquitous, and impossible to block. Their arrows sang through the air, a whistling rain of iron that smelled of burnt fletching and horse sweat, striking before the enemy could even finish a battle cry. When they met the Jin dynasty's stone wall forts, the Mongols didn't charge head-on. They circled like a pack of wolves, launching volleys from a distance that made the Jin soldiers feel like they were stuck in a medieval video game on hard mode. The Jin's iron gates clanged, but the Mongols simply rode around, their hooves kicking up dust that tasted of iron and fear. Each victory added a new trick to their playbook, sharpening their strategic edge like a whetstone on a samurai sword. The real test came in the scorching deserts of Khwarezm, where the sun baked the sand into a golden paste that stuck to every soldier's skin like cheap glue. Genghis demanded tribute, the Khwarezmian ruler scoffed, and the Mongols responded by turning the empire's own caravans into a moving feast of chaos, spices, silk, and the occasional startled camel. The battles were a blur of sand, blood, and the metallic tang of broken swords, while the Mongol banners fluttered like angry seagulls over the dunes. Each conquest peeled back another layer of the empire's might, revealing a terrifying efficiency that made the enemy's generals look as clueless as a tourist with a broken GPS. By the time the dust settled, the Mongols had stitched a new map of conquest, each victory a bright, blood-stained stitch in the fabric of their growing empire. But even as Genghis's horde roared across continents, cracks began to whisper in the wind, rumors of jealous generals, hungry heirs, and soldiers tired of living on a diet of dried meat and endless campaigns. The Yasa's strict rules, once a unifying force, now felt like a parental curfew to battle-hardened warriors who'd grown up on the smell of gunpowder and horse manure. Genghis, ever the showman, joked that his empire was like a massive potluck. Everyone brings something, but someone's always going to steal the last piece of yak cheese. These internal tensions simmered like a pot left too long over a fire, promising future betrayals that would later echo through history. Still, for a fleeting moment, the Mongol horde stood united, a thunderous, horse-driven symphony that would forever echo across the steppes. The steppe stretched like a golden ocean, and the Mongol horde rolled over it in a thunderous tide of horse hooves and war cries. Dust rose in plumes that turned the sun into a hazy amber lantern, while the scent of sweat and horse manure clung to every rider's cloak. Genghis's banners snapped in the wind, each one a promise of conquest that fluttered like a restless spirit. From the Altai to the Aral, villages fell like dominoes, their thatched roofs collapsing under the weight of a relentless cavalry. Even the desert foxes seemed to pause, bewildered by the sheer scale of a force that moved faster than a gossip chain in a market. When the Mongols reached the stone walls of Samarkand, they discovered that arrows alone could not crumble centuries of brick and mortar. The clang of trebuchets being hauled into place echoed like a metal orchestra, and the Mongol engineers, captured Persian masters, began sketching siege ladders on the spot. With a grin, Subutai ordered the construction of a massive mangonel that hurled flaming projectiles, turning the night sky into a fireworks show that would make a 4th of July crowd jealous. The city's defenders, accustomed to fending off nomads with bows, now stared at a siege engine that looked like a medieval version of a giant slingshot, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. By dawn, the walls trembled, the gates cracked, and the scent of burning timber mingled with the sweet perfume of victory. Inside the camp, the air grew thick with more than just smoke. Rivalry simmered between Urgidei, Genghis's ambitious son, and Talyui, the stoic younger brother with a knack for strategy. Urgidei swaggered around the fire, boasting that he could outdrink a yak and outmarch a storm, while Talyui whispered plans that sounded like chess moves in a game of Risk. Their banter crackled louder than the campfire, and the troops caught the irony of two princes squabbling over who would get the biggest share of the spoils, like toddlers fighting over the last slice of pizza. Yet beneath the jokes, each knew that a misstep could splinter the horde, turning a unified thunderhead into a scattered flock of angry crows. In the end, Genghis's ghost seemed to hover over the council, reminding them that the empire's strength lay in unity, not in who could shout the loudest. As winter of 1223 descended, the steppe turned into a frozen wasteland where the wind howled like a pack of wolves on a full moon hunt. Snow piled up on the horses' backs, turning their sleek silhouettes into waddling, frost-bitten behemoths that snorted clouds of icy breath. Supplies dwindled. The scent of rotting meat seeped from the dwindling stores, and the men's stomachs growled louder than any battle cry. Yet the Mongols pressed on, chewing on dried yak jerky and sharing stories of past victories to keep morale from freezing solid. When a blizzard slammed the camp, the soldiers huddled under tarps, their laughter echoing through the storm like a defiant karaoke session in a snow globe. By the time the thaw arrived, the Mongol horde stood at a crossroads, literally and metaphorically, ready to carve a new route through the heart of Eurasia. The captured engineers had been conscripted into the army, their knowledge of catapults and fortifications now a secret weapon tucked into the Mongol playbook. Urgide and Talyui, their rivalry tempered by the cold, found a grudging respect, each realizing that their combined cunning could turn the world into a giant chessboard. The scent of fresh pine replaced the stench of winter, and the camp buzzed with the promise of more cities, more gold, and more stories to tell around future fires. And so, with the steppes wind at their backs, the Mongols marched onward, a living crossroads of conquest that would echo through history like a drumbeat that never stops. When Urgide took the reins, he swapped his throne for a war horse and announced the empire's most daring gamble yet, a thunderous push into Eastern Europe and a ruthless siege of Baghdad. The steppe air crackled with the scent of horse sweat and pine smoke as tens of thousands of riders swore oaths louder than a stadium chant. Urgide's council, a mix of hardened generals and shrewd advisors, plotted routes on animal skins as if drawing a giant game board. The mood was electric, like the moment before a roller coaster drop, because everyone knew the world would never be the same after this. The Mongol horde surged westward, a living tumbleweed of steel-capped helmets and banners that fluttered like angry flags in a gale. Their horses thundered across the plains, kicking up dust that tasted of iron and ambition, while the distant villages heard the rumble and thought a meteor shower was arriving. Scouts whispered rumors of a barbarian invasion that made European nobles clutch their pearls like reality TV fans watching a surprise twist. Yet the Mongols laughed at the idea of borders. To them, a map was just a suggestion, and every step forward felt like a punchline to an ancient prophecy. The siege of Kiev unfolded like a medieval version of Risk, only with actual blood and fewer polite handshakes. Mongol archers rained arrows that sang through the night, each whiz a sharp note in a grim symphony of steel and terror. The city walls, once proud and unyielding, began to crumble under trebuchet blows that smelled of burnt wood and desperation. Inside, the scent of fear mingled with the acrid smoke of burning homes, while the defenders muttered curses that sounded like bad karaoke lyrics. When the gates finally fell, the Mongols stormed in, their laughter echoing off the shattered stone like a twisted victory dance. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, soon found itself under the shadow of a Mongol storm that smelled of camel dung and charred parchment. The Tigris River ran red with the remnants of a once glorious library, its waters carrying the ash of countless manuscripts like a tragic confetti parade. Urgide's forces, relentless as a binge-watch marathon, tore through streets, their swords flashing brighter than a Hollywood blockbuster's special effects. The caliph's palace, once a palace of pearls, turned into a smoky ruin where the only music was the crackle of fire and the distant wail of a minaret collapsing. As the last torch sputtered out, the world seemed to hold its breath, realizing that even the brightest civilization could be snuffed like a candle in a hurricane. With the Abbasid Caliphate reduced to ash, the world trembled as if the very ground had been shaken by a giant's footstep. European courts sent envoys clutching nervous scrolls, their faces pale as if they'd just watched a horror movie trailer for the first time. In the steppe, Urgide raised a toast with fermented mare's milk, toasting an empire that now stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, a nomadic empire that made the concept of small sound like a joke. Yet amid the triumph, a quiet irony lingered. The same horse-driven cavalry that could topple cities also struggled to keep a stable Wi-Fi signal, if only they'd invented it. History would remember this apex not just for its conquests, but for the way it forced every corner of the globe to ask, who's really in charge here? When Genghis Khan's funeral pyre crackled into ash, his empire didn't dissolve like a puff of horse dung. It splintered into 4 hungry khanates, each eyeing the other's granaries. The Golden Horde roared across the Russian steppes, the Ilkhanate clutched the Persian sun, the Chagatai realm prowled Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty tried to rule China with a Mongol swagger. Yet even as borders shifted like nomadic campfires, the echo of the great Khan's law, Yasa, still rang in the wind. Traders felt the lingering pulse of the steppe, a reminder that the world was now stitched together by a single sprawling horsehair rope. And somewhere in the steppes, a lone yurt whispered, "We built it, we didn't break it." Under the banner of Pax Mongolica, the Silk Road transformed from a dusty back alley into a bustling highway of silk, spices, and scandal. Caravanserais sprouted like oasis cafes, where the scent of cumin mingled with the acrid tang of camel urine, and merchants haggled over jade while a Mongol guard sipped fermented mare's milk. The clatter of horse hooves became the metronome of commerce, carrying letters faster than a gossip chain in a medieval tavern. Silk from Guangzhou fluttered beside Persian rugs, while a curious Venetian merchant tried to barter a glass eye for a sack of dried yak cheese. Even the dreaded plague rode these routes, hitchhiking on rats and reminding everyone that trade has a nasty side effect: global pandemics. As goods changed hands, ideas did too, spilling across borders like spilled tea on a silk carpet. Persian astronomers taught Chinese astronomers to read the stars without a dragon's tail, while Mongol patrons funded the translation of Sanskrit epics into Arabic, creating a literary mash-up worthy of a Netflix crossover. Buddhist monks rode the same routes as Muslim scholars, swapping prayer beads for prayer mats, and the occasional joke about who stole the camel's lunch became the era's meme. In the bustling markets of Samarkand, a troubadour could hear the distant echo of a Mongol war drum and the delicate pluck of a Chinese pipa, a soundtrack that would make even the most stoic Genghis grin. The cultural stew simmered, leaving a taste as rich and confusing as a kebab wrapped in a tortilla. Behind the scenes, Mongol administrators scribbled on paper rolls, inventing a tax system that could count sheep, grain, and even the number of horses a noble owned. Think of it as the original spreadsheet, but with more horse drool. They erected a relay network of stone towers, the Yam, where fresh horses waited like caffeinated baristas, ensuring messages sprinted across continents faster than a rumor about a royal scandal. These bureaucratic tricks seeped into later empires, the Ottoman Timur land grant, and the Russian Pomesti both borrowed the Mongol playbook of rewarding service with land and loyalty. Even the concept of a unified legal code, a proto-constitution, echoed in the later Napoleonic Code, proving that a steppe nomad could out-lawyer a European court. The Mongols proved that you don't need marble columns, just a sturdy saddle and a good memory to leave an administrative imprint. So when we look back at the steppe's legacy, we see more than just a trail of conquered cities. We see a world stitched together by horsehair, ink, and relentless curiosity. The empire's fragments may have crumbled like a poorly baked naan, but the ideas they spread endure in our banks, our maps, and even in the way we binge-watch historical dramas. The irony is delicious. A people who once prized mobility now gave us the very roads that keep us glued to our screens. Their story reminds us that greatness can rise from dust, wind, and a relentless herd, leaving a footprint larger than any palace wall. And if you ever hear a distant thunder on the plains, it might just be the echo of that ancient, unstoppable steppe heartbeat. The wind howls across the endless sea of grass, a dry whisper that carries the scent of horse sweat and yak dung, announcing the brutal reality of the Mongolian steppe. Young Temujin, barely a boy, watches tribal feuds flare like sparks from a blacksmith's forge, each clan shouting curses louder than the hawks circling above. One bitter night, a rival warband slaughters his father, the great Yesujay, and the blood-soaked ground still smells of pine tar and fear. Orphaned, Temujin feels the sting of loss like a cold arrow to the heart, yet the steppe's unforgiving sun forces him to stand. He swears a silent oath that the blood of his kin will not be wasted, even if it means learning to ride the chaos like a rider on a wild stallion. Exiled to the desolate outskirts, Temujin learns that survival on the steppe is a cruel teacher, one that hands out lessons in the form of frozen rivers and gnawing wolves. He sleeps in a lean-to of goat skins, the smell of damp earth and goat milk clinging to his nose, while his stomach growls louder than a war drum. In that bleak camp, he meets a scrappy boy named Jamaka, whose grin is as sharp as a saber, and whose loyalty is as fickle as the wind. Together they hunt antelope, their arrows slicing the air with a hiss that sounds suspiciously like a Netflix trailer's dramatic swoosh. By the firelight, they trade stories and promises, forging a bond that will later become both sword and scar in the saga of the steppe. When the exile ends, Temujin returns to his tribe with a ragged coat and a head full of firebrand ideas, startling his kin like a surprise cameo in a low-budget epic. He rallies a handful of outcasts, hungry men with bruised faces and a shared taste for revenge, offering them a vision of unity that sounds as impossible as a Netflix binge without Wi-Fi. Their first skirmish is a messy tumble of dust, horse hooves pounding the ground, the metallic tang of blood mixing with the sweet scent of crushed wildflowers. The clash ends with Temujin's side standing victorious, their laughter echoing over the plains, a wild, ironic celebration that the underdogs have just outmaneuvered the seasoned warlords. The steppe, ever the indifferent audience, watches this drama unfold with the same indifferent stare it gives to a sunrise. Yet triumph brings its own cruelty. The very allies Temujin courted begin to whisper doubts, their eyes flickering like candle flames in a storm. He feels the sting of betrayal as sharply as the cold bite of a winter night, when a trusted brother in arms deserts him for a rival clan, leaving behind a half-eaten carcass of a goat as a mocking token. The irony is thick. He who once fled into exile now finds himself trapped by the very loyalty he tried to build. Still, he laughs at the absurdity, cracking a joke about his fate being as tangled as a Game of Thrones plot twist, and uses the ridicule as fuel for his next move. The steppes' unforgiving ground becomes his training mat, each stumble a lesson, each scar a badge of honor. By the time the sun dips low, painting the horizon in blood-red hues, Temujin stands on a hilltop, his breath fogging in the chill air, eyes scanning the endless grass like a general eyeing a chessboard. The scent of pine smoke from distant fires mingles with the metallic perfume of recent battle, reminding him that every victory is paid for in sweat and sorrow. He gathers his fledgling band, now a ragtag army of hardened warriors, and whispers a promise that the steppes' endless quarrels will end under one banner. The irony is palpable. A boy who once hid from wolves now intends to command them. As night falls, the stars glitter above like a cosmic audience, and the blood of the steppe pulses through his veins, heralding the rise of a legend who will soon be called Genghis Khan. The wind over the Mongolian steppe howled like a restless crowd at a rock concert, rattling the felt tents where Temujin plotted his future. He rode to the court of Togrul, the wolf of the Karate, with a gift of raw horse meat and a grin that said, "I come in peace, but I bring a lot of meat." The old chieftain, impressed by the audacity and the scent of fresh blood, agreed to seal their pact with a marriage to his daughter, Bert, a union that smelled of perfume, sweat, and political ambition. As they exchanged vows under a sky bruised purple by sunset, the steppe seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the fireworks of destiny. Little did anyone know that this alliance would become the spark that lit the whole continent. Back in his own camp, Temujin began gathering a band of warriors who answered not to kinship but to competence, a concept as novel as a smartphone in the 13th century. He tested each man with a simple rule. Whoever could lift a heavy yurt pole and still keep his beard unscathed earned a place beside him. The clang of iron swords, the smell of horse urine, and the occasional laugh when a lanky recruit tripped over his own shadow filled the air. Merit, not birth, became the new currency, and the men learned to respect a leader who could spot a good fighter faster than a hawk spots a mouse. By the time the sun set, the camp sounded like a well-tuned drumline, each beat echoing the promise of a meritocratic empire. Word of Temujin's growing force spread like gossip at a market, and rival clans snarled in envy, ready to test the newcomer's mettle. The first clash erupted near the river Kurlan, where the water ran brown with mud and the iron scent of blood. Arrows whistled past like angry bees, and the clang of shields rang louder than a tavern brawl after the ale ran out. Temujin rode at the front, his eyes blazing, shouting orders that cut through the chaos as cleanly as a sword through silk. When the dust settled, the enemy lay strewn like broken toys, and the survivors tasted the bitter tang of defeat on their tongues. The marriage feast that followed could have been a scene from a medieval sitcom. Endless platters of fermented mare's milk, a chorus of drunken minstrels, and Bert trying to keep a straight face while Temujin attempted a dance that resembled a wild goat on a trampoline. Even the stoic Togrul cracked a smile when a clumsy warrior knocked over a barrel of goat cheese, sending a pungent cloud that made everyone cough and laugh. Amid the revelry, Temujin whispered to his new allies that the real battle was not just for land, but for hearts, and that loyalty could be bought with a good story and a hearty laugh. The night glittered with firelight, the smell of smoked meat, and the occasional stray horse's whinny that sounded suspiciously like a sarcastic comment. By sunrise, the alliance felt as solid as a stone fortress, even if the guests were still a little hungover. With Bert by his side and a legion of merit-tested warriors at his back, Temujin stood on the ridge overlooking the endless grasslands, feeling the wind like a drum roll before a grand performance. He knew the steppe was a fickle audience, ready to cheer one day and betray the next, but he also knew that a leader who earned respect could command even the most capricious crowd. The scent of pine needles and fresh horse dung reminded him that greatness was forged in the gritty, smelly moments as much as in glorious victories. As the sun rose, casting gold across the horizon, Temujin whispered a promise to the spirits of his ancestors. He would unite the tribes or die trying, and maybe, just maybe, write a story worth telling around future campfires. The stage was set, the alliances were forged in fire, and the world would soon hear the thunder of the Mongol hooves. The wind howled across the endless steppe, carrying the scent of horse sweat and fresh horse manure. Nothing says welcome to Mongolia like a whiff of dung in the morning. Temujin, a wiry youth with a scar that looked like a lightning bolt, gathered his ragtag band of kin and set out on daring raids that would make a modern-day pirate blush. He rode out before dawn, his cloak flapping like a banner of chaos, and let the thunder of hooves drown out any doubts. The tribes watched, half in awe, half in terror, as he slipped through enemy camps like a shadow that had learned to whisper. By nightfall, the steppe echoed with the clatter of broken spears and the low, guttural cheers of those who survived his surprise attacks. First on Temujin's hit list was the Karait, a clan as proud as a peacock, but as slippery as oil on ice. He ordered his men to disguise themselves as wandering shepherds, complete with fake wool coats that smelled of goat and pine, then slipped into the Karait stronghold under the cover of a moonlit snowstorm. When the Karait awoke to the sound of clanking armor and the stench of burnt yak meat, panic erupted like a spilled barrel of fermented mare's milk. Temujin's warriors surged forward, their arrows whistling and their swords flashing, cutting down the bewildered defenders with ruthless efficiency. The Karait chief fell, clutching a broken bow, and the surviving tribesfolk stared at the carnage, wondering whether they had witnessed a battle or a barbaric ballet. Emboldened, Temujin turned his eyes to the Naaman, a tribe whose name meant the Eight, but whose tactics felt more like a tangled knot of spaghetti. He introduced a cunning new trick. The feigned retreat, a move that made his enemies think they'd won, only to have his horsemen spin around like a surprise encore at a rock concert. The Naaman cavalry chased the fleeing Mongols, only to find themselves surrounded by hidden archers whose arrows sang like angry birds. The clash was a mess of blood, dust, and the metallic tang of sweat, with bodies piling up like a grotesque sculpture of war. When the dust settled, the Naaman leader lay panting, his beard tangled in his own hair, and the remaining warriors muttered that fighting Temujin was like trying to outwit a clever fox with a smartphone. With the Karait and Naaman broken, Temujin began stitching the shattered tribes together under a single banner, a black horse on a crimson field that looked as fierce as a superhero logo. He hosted grand feasts where roasted boar sizzled over open flames, the smoke curling up like ghostly applause, and he made sure every chief got a share of the spoils, even if it meant handing over a prized yak that smelled like old cheese. He spoke in the language of fire and blood, promising protection against rival warlords and the occasional marauding bear that liked to steal sheep. The tribes, weary from endless skirmishes, found his promises as comforting as a warm blanket on a freezing night, and they swore allegiance while clinking their cups of fermented mare's milk. Humor spread like wildfire, with jokes about Temujin's hairdo, a mane that could hide a whole squirrel, and the whole steppe seemed to grin at the thought of finally having a leader who could actually keep the peace. By the time the sun set over the rolling hills, the steppe rang with the sound of unified drums, each beat echoing the heartbeat of a new empire in the making. Temujin, now known as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, stood atop a hill, his cloak billowing, his eyes scanning the horizon like a director eyeing the final scene of an epic movie. The wind carried the distant howl of wolves, a reminder that danger still lurked, but also the faint scent of fresh pine, promising new growth. He raised his sword, its blade catching the last light, and shouted a rallying cry that sounded part war chant, part karaoke lyric, and the entire steppe answered in unison. The unification campaign had turned a chaotic mosaic of tribes into a single roaring beast, ready to gallop across history. The sun blazed over the endless sea of grass as the great Kurultai unfurled like a living tapestry of tents, banners, and restless horsemen. Smoke from countless campfires curled into the sky, mixing with the pungent scent of horse urine and roasted yak meat that made even the hardiest nomad wince. Drums thumped like a giant heartbeat, and the clang of armor echoed across the steppe, rattling the very bones of the earth. In the center, Temujin stood on a raised mound, his eyes glittering like polished obsidian, while elders whispered legends of wolves and destiny. The crowd lined in, hungry for a moment that would rewrite history, as if the wind itself held its breath. When the chief shaman raised his hand, a hush fell over the throng, and the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. With a voice that roared louder than a war horn, he declared, "From this day forth, Temujin shall be called Genghis Khan." The name rolled across the steppe like a thunderclap, and some warriors cracked jokes about finally getting a proper title for their favorite meme lord. Laughter rippled through the ranks, but it was edged with a fierce pride that felt like a freshly sharpened saber. The newly crowned Wolf King lifted his hand, and the assembled tribes answered with a chorus of hooves and cheers that could have startled a dragon. Genghis Khan unfurled his new law code, the Yasa, on a leather scroll that smelled of ink and goat skin. He promised swift justice, banning theft, desertion, and the dreaded habit of leaving a mess in the communal fire pit. Yes, even the steppe had a zero-tolerance policy for littering. The laws were as blunt as a mace, but as precise as a hawk's talon, demanding loyalty, discipline, and the occasional reminder that no one could cheat on their share of the spoils. Soldiers listened, eyes narrowing, as if the code were a cheat code for world domination, and they nodded like they'd just been handed the ultimate power-up. The crowd cheered, some muttering that the new rules made the steppe feel less like a wild party and more like a well-run startup. With the Yasa in hand, Genghis turned to his army, a sea of hardened warriors whose breath fogged in the cold morning air. He drilled them in the art of the bow, the clang of steel, and the discipline of marching in perfect formation, no more wandering like a herd of lost goats. The sound of arrows snapping back like rubber bands filled the plain, while the scent of sweat, leather, and the occasional goat stew wafted through the camps. He taught them to ride as one organism, each horse's hooves beating in unison like a massive drum solo at a rock concert. By the end of the day, the troops moved with the sleek efficiency of a well-choreographed flash mob, ready to spill blood across continents. The Kurultai's thunderous applause faded into the rustle of the steppe, but the echo of Genghis Khan's vision lingered like a promise whispered to the wind. With a united tribe, a strict code, and an army that could outrun a cheetah on a caffeine binge, the stage was set for a conquest that would dwarf any Netflix binge watch of epic battles. The horizon glowed with the first hints of sunrise, painting the world in gold as if the gods themselves were rolling out a red carpet. Genghis tipped his helmet, eyes scanning the endless plains, and muttered something about making history, not just a footnote. The world would soon learn that a wolf crowned on a steppe could howl louder than any empire before it. When Temujin first raised his banner over the dusty steppe, the wind seemed to carry a new scent, sharp iron mingling with the sweet perfume of wild thyme. His early victories, like the crushing of the Tatars at the Battle of the Balakin, sent shockwaves that rattled the yurts of rival clans. The clang of swords and the guttural cries of wounded horses echoed across the plains, turning fear into a strange kind of admiration. Even the nomads who once mocked the outcast whispered, "If he can tame a bear with a bow, maybe he can tame us too." Word of Temujin's triumphs traveled faster than a horse on a caffeine rush, reaching the bustling markets of Samarkand, where silk merchants sniffed the air for profit. Caravans once wary of bandits now rode under the Mongol banner, their camels' hooves thudding like a drumbeat of destiny. The newly forged trade route smelled of spices, burning incense, and the occasional whiff of horse manure, an honest reminder that empire building isn't all glitz. Traders began to barter not just goods but stories, spreading the legend of a leader who could unite warring tribes the way a DJ mixes beats at a rave. Back on the steppe, the great Khan's law, written on wooden plaques and shouted from mountaintops, taught that loyalty was worth more than a sack of gold. Villagers gathered around crackling fires, the scent of smoked lamb filling the night as elders recited the yasa, a code that felt oddly like a medieval version of a user agreement. Children giggled, daring each other to chant the oath while trying not to step on the skittering lizards that darted across the ground. In the background, the distant thunder of war drums reminded everyone that unity was a shield, not a blanket. As the Mongol network stretched from the Pacific to the Persian Gulf, the steppe transformed into a living, breathing superhighway. Merchants shouted in dozens of languages, the clamor sounding like a chaotic orchestra tuning before a performance. The smell of fresh yak milk mingled with the acrid smoke of distant battles, creating a sensory tapestry that was both intoxicating and terrifying. Even the most hardened warriors found themselves humming a tune reminiscent of a modern pop chorus, we will unite you," as they marched under a sky painted with the blood-red hues of sunset. By the time Temujin took the name Genghis Khan, his rise from outcast to empire builder felt like a mythic video game level up, complete with boss fights and cheat codes. The legacy he left was not just a map of conquered lands, but a promise that the steppe could be more than endless grass. It could be a conduit for ideas, goods, and cultures. The air was thick with the scent of victory, sweat, and the occasional whiff of burnt incense from a celebratory feast. As the sun set over the endless horizon, the echo of his name lingered, reminding the world that a single determined soul could rewrite the script of history. The wind howls across the endless sea of grass, carrying the scent of dry earth and goat milk like a gossip that never stops. In a dusty hollow, a lanky teenager named Temujin rounds up a ragtag troop of families whose loyalty is still as shaky as a newborn foal's first steps. He offers them more than meat and shelter. He promises a code carved from iron, blood, and the stubbornness of a yak refusing to move. The youngsters stare, half bewildered, half fascinated, as he sketches out a future where every arrow counts and every man's worth is measured by his bite, not his birthright. The steppe itself seems to lean in, listening to the whispered vows that will soon become the backbone of an empire. First, Temujin forces the clan to swap their old tribal squabbles for a strict schedule of drills that feel like a brutal dance party, except the music is the thundering hooves and the occasional goat bleat. He discards the notion that noble blood makes a better warrior, instead rewarding the fastest arrow shooter, the toughest horse tamer, and the guy who can carry a wounded comrade up a hill without whining. The men learn to eat like wolves, gnawing on dried yak meat while the sun bakes their backs, and they sleep in circles so close that you could hear each other's heartbeats. In the evenings, they share stories around a fire that crackles like a gossip column, forging kinship that feels more like a chosen family than a forced alliance. By the time the moon rises, the code of discipline is as ingrained as the scar on Temujin's cheek, and everyone knows that failure means a swift, merciless cut, no second chances, no apologies. Training turns the steppe into a living obstacle course. Riders must leap over thorny burrows, dodge swarms of gnats that taste like sour milk, and wrestle unruly stallions that smell of horse dung and pine sap. The air is thick with the metallic tang of blood when a novice falls off and scrapes his knee on a jagged stone, yet the laughter that erupts is louder than the pain, as if the universe itself is watching a slapstick comedy. Temujin watches from a hilltop, his eyes sharp as hawk talons, and occasionally cracks a joke about the warriors looking like a flock of oversized chickens, an odd compliment in that world. The horses, sleek as midnight shadows, become extensions of the riders, their breath hot and wet against the warriors' faces, forging a bond tighter than any rope. By the end of each grueling day, the scent of sweat, leather, and fresh horse manure clings to them like a badge of honor. When the first skirmish erupts, the Mongol band moves like a single, roaring organism, their arrows singing a mournful tune that would make even a bard weep. They employ a tactic that looks like a chaotic game of chess, except the pieces are riders who can disappear into the dust and reappear behind enemy lines like ninjas on horseback. The enemy, expecting a slow, lumbering horde, instead faces a whirlwind of spears that prick the air like popcorn kernels in a hot pan. Temujin's grin widens as he watches the foe's faces turn pale, realizing they've been outmaneuvered by a group that treats discipline like a video game cheat code. The battle ends with the steppe echoing with the clatter of broken shields, the metallic scent of blood, and the faint, ironic chuckle of a warlord who just turned a bunch of strangers into a fearsome army. As the dust settles, the wind carries the tale of the whispering steppe far beyond the horizon, muttering about a young leader who turned loyalty into a weapon sharper than any sword. The survivors gather around a fire that crackles like an old vinyl record, recounting the day they learned that merit beats lineage, and that a well-timed joke can keep morale higher than a mountain goat on a cliff. Temujin, now more legend than man, watches his men, once families, now a single fierce heartbeat, march toward the next sunrise, their silhouettes blending with the golden grass. The steppe, ever watchful, seems to whisper back, promising more conquests, more blood, and more stories that will be told around countless campfires. And somewhere, a distant tribe hears the wind's gossip and wonders whether they should start polishing their own arrows. When Temujin summoned his fledgling army, he rolled out a spreadsheet before spreadsheets existed, the decimal organization. He split his warriors into units of 10, 100, and 1,000, each with its own flag and fierce pride, like a giant Lego set that could snap together or fall apart at a whistle. The clatter of wooden armor and the sharp bark of commands turned the steppe into a marching metronome. Even the wind seemed to hum a rhythm, as if the earth itself was counting beats. The irony. A nomadic kid from the grasslands invented a system that would make modern HR departments weep with envy. Next, Temujin ordered his blacksmiths to bake hardened saddle blankets, thick as a baker's loaf and as tough as a dragon's hide. They soaked the felt in boiled oil, then pounded it until it sang a low, sizzling sigh, smell of burnt wool mingling with campfire smoke. When a rider perched on his steed, the blanket acted like a shock absorber, muffling the thudding hooves and letting the horse sprint without feeling the sting of the rocky trail. The riders could feel the steady thrum of their mounts, a comforting drumbeat that drowned out the whine of enemy arrows. It was the medieval equivalent of a high-tech cushioned insole, only without the patent office drama. But the crown jewel of mobility was the double-tethered horse system, a clever two-rope leash that let a rider hop from one mount to another without stopping. One rope attached to the saddle, the other to the horse's flank, so if a stallion stumbled, the rider could yank free and grab a fresh charger like a kid swapping sneakers at recess. The clatter of hooves doubled, the air filled with the salty scent of sweat and horse manure, and the Mongols laughed as they left bewildered foes chewing on dust. Imagine a biker gang with a spare bike chained to each rider, ready to swap mid-ride, only with more fur and less leather jackets. This trick turned every pursuit into a choreographed dance, and the enemy's cavalry looked like a troop of clumsy toddlers trying to keep up. Armed with decimal squads, padded blankets, and the double tether, the Mongol hordes could outmarch any army across scorching deserts and jagged mountains. Their boots sank into sand that hissed like a kettle, yet they surged forward, the sun beating down like a relentless drum solo. In the high passes, the thin air smelled of pine sap and cold stone, while the horse's breath fogged like ghostly whispers. When a rival army set up camp, the Mongols arrived before the sunrise, their banners fluttering like startled birds, and the enemy's watchmen heard only the soft rustle of grass and the distant clink of armor. No war cries, just a quiet confidence. The result, victories delivered before the opponent even finished their morning tea. So the next time you binge watch a Netflix series that paints the Mongols as ruthless barbarians, remember they were the original mobility ninjas, a mix of Steve Jobs' product design and a circus troupe's acrobatics. Their secret sauce was simple: organize like a spreadsheet, cushion like a luxury car seat, and swap horses like swapping phones at a tech expo. The desert wind still carries the faint echo of their hooves, a reminder that speed and cleverness can outshine sheer numbers. As the old saying goes, if you can't beat them, ride faster than they can count. And that, dear listeners, is why the art of mobility still makes history feel like a high-octane chase scene. When the steppe wind whispered, a lattice of Mongol eyes stretched farther than the horizon, a living web of scouts, messengers, and spies that could hear a horse's sneeze in a neighboring kingdom. These riders slipped through forests like ghosts, their leather boots muffling the crunch of pine needles as they slipped messages sealed with wax and blood. In the dead of night, they lit tiny fires on hilltops, sending smoke signals that looked like the flicker of a dragon's breath to the untrained eye. The Empire's inbox was a river of parchment, each note a droplet of truth or a deliberately crafted lie, and the Mongols read it all with the relish of a kid opening a mystery box. Even the most stoic warlords found themselves tangled in a game of telephone that the steppe masters played like a grandmaster on a chessboard. The hallmark of Mongol cunning was the feigned retreat, a tactical joke that left enemies clutching their swords in bewildered applause. Imagine a disciplined cavalry charging, then suddenly pulling back as if the ground itself were a trap, only to lure the pursuers into a valley that smelled of damp earth and fear. The fleeing horsemen kicked up clouds of dust that turned the sky a murky orange, while hidden archers waited like impatient cats behind the rocks. When the enemy's formation broke, the Mongols turned on a dime, their lances snapping forward like the jaws of a steel-toothed beast. The defeated soldiers tasted the bitter irony of being outwitted by a strategy that seemed as simple as a child's game of tag. Smoke screens and false banners were the Mongols' version of modern special effects, turning battlefields into theatrical stages. They would light bundles of dried reeds, sending thick, acrid plumes curling upward, masking the clatter of hooves and the twang of bowstrings beneath a choking haze. At the same time, they unfurled captured enemy standards, waving them like confused tourists holding up a wrong map, confusing friend from foe. The air grew heavy with the smell of burnt straw and the metallic tang of blood, while soldiers shouted orders that dissolved into the fog. By the time the real troops emerged, the chaos was so thick that even the most seasoned commander felt like he'd walked onto the set of a low-budget fantasy film. While the theatrics raged, Mongol scouts slipped into enemy camps like sneaky teenagers stealing cookies, gathering intel on terrain, morale, and even the favorite tavern brew of the opposing general. They noted the slope of a hill, the slickness of a riverbank after a recent rain, and the way the sun painted the western ridge with a golden glow that could blind a careless archer. They whispered about the troops' morale, detecting a nervous tremor in a soldier's grip on his spear, or the sour smell of fear wafting from a tent where a commander's wife wept. This data, catalogued on parchment scrolls, allowed the Mongols to plan attacks that fit the landscape like a glove, striking when the enemy's spirits were as low as a damp horse's mane. In essence, they turned every battlefield into a meticulously rehearsed dance, choreographed by the tiniest details only a keen eye could catch. The result was a cascade of bewildered enemies stumbling over their own shadows, a spectacle that would make even the most seasoned Hollywood director raise an eyebrow. Imagine a Roman legion, proud as a peacock, suddenly chasing phantom banners through a fog that smelled like burnt pine and sweat, only to be ambushed by riders who appeared like a sudden internet meme. Did you just get wrecked? Except the meme was arrows raining down. The Mongols' blend of deception and intelligence turned war into a grand improv show, where the audience never knew whether they were the stars or the punchline. Their success lay not just in brute force, but in the delicious irony of winning battles with tricks that would make a magician blush. And so the stepp's whispering web kept humming, forever reminding us that sometimes the sharpest sword is a well-placed lie. The sun bled red over the desert as the Mongol war drums rolled like thunderheads. Genghis's riders appeared on the horizon, a sea of sable and steel that made the sand itself shiver. They rode into Khwarezm not as invaders, but as a storm, their banners snapping in the wind like angry kites. The city walls, once thought impregnable, seemed to tremble at the distant clatter of hooves and the smell of horse sweat. In that moment, the Khwarezmian defenders realized they were about to be caught in a tale that would later be told around campfires as the storm that never stopped. The Mongols split into 3 wings, each slipping through a different gate as if the city were a giant birthday cake. While one column hurled themselves at the main gate, a second swooped around the western wall, and a third circled behind, shouting nonsense that sounded like a medieval version of surprise, mother effer. Their coordination was so tight that the Khwarezmian sentries could barely finish a cup of tea before a fresh wave of horsemen crashed into their ranks. This multi-pronged assault turned the defenders' own streets into a chaotic chessboard where every pawn suddenly became a queen. The irony was palpable. The very gates the Khwarezmian architects had bragged about were now being used as doorways for a surprise party they never RSVP'd to. From the flanks, the famed horse archers unleashed a rain of arrows that sang like angry cicadas over the city's stone alleys. The twang of bowstrings mixed with the metallic clang of armor, creating a soundtrack that would make any modern video game composer weep. Dust rose in thick clouds, choking the air with the scent of burnt leather and the sweet metallic tang of blood. Yet the archers kept moving, their horses kicking up sand as they turned, reloaded, and fired again with the efficiency of a fast food drive-through. Even the city's cats fled in terror, their tiny yowls swallowed by the roar of thousands of hooves and the occasional whoosh of an arrow slicing the sky. When the walls finally gave way, the Mongol engineers strutted onto the battlefield like handyman superheroes with a toolbox of terror. They salvaged broken trebuchets from the ruins, patched them with leather straps and spare wood, and turned them into death launchers aimed at the remaining towers. Each counterweight slammed down with a deafening boom that sent shockwaves through the stone, scattering debris like popcorn at a fireworks show. The scent of hot iron and crushed stone filled the air, mingling with the acrid smoke of burning granaries and the occasional waft of goat cheese from a terrified market stall. Watching the engineers work was like seeing a crew from the Fast and the Furious rebuild a car mid-race, except the car was a giant catapult and the race was for survival. In the end, the Khwarezmian cities fell not just because of brute force, but because of the Mongols' uncanny blend of speed, surprise, and siegecraft. Their tactics resembled a well-timed heist. The distraction, the swift grab, and the clean-up crew hauling away the loot while the guards were still dizzy. The survivors whispered that the storm had a mind of its own, a relentless force that laughed at the idea of a polite surrender. Even centuries later, historians can't help but picture Genghis's commanders checking their watches like they were on a reality show timer, shouting "Time's up," as the last tower crumbled. And so the legend of the storm at Khwarezm lives on, a reminder that when you mix horse archers, engineers, and a dash of audacious humor, you get a recipe that would make even the toughest chef say, "Now that's a spicy stew." When the Mongol banner unfurled from the Pacific surf to the Danube's mist, it wasn't just a sea of horsehair and steel. It was the whisper of a hidden sword, a doctrine inked in blood and sand. The empire stretched like a giant's arm, each fingertip gripping a city, each knuckle crushing a rebellion. Yet behind the thunderous gallop lay three quiet commandments: flexible command, psychological warfare, and logistical foresight. These were not lofty theories, but gritty, mud-splattered manuals that generals tucked into their leather satchels. Tonight, we pull that secret scroll from the dust and read how the Mongol thunder still rattles the world's foundations. Imagine a chessboard where the pieces can leap off the board and rewrite the rules mid-game. That was Genghis's flexible command. Subutai, the original strategic ninja, would split his 150,000 horsemen into bite-sized packets, each acting like an independent brain while still humming the same battle hymn. When a sudden blizzard turned the steppe into a whitewashed arena, those packets melted into the storm, reappearing behind the enemy like ghosts with a GPS glitch. The secret. Every commander carried a pocket-sized what-if list, swapping leaders like swapping hats at a Mongol fashion show. The result was a force that could pivot faster than a TikTok trend, leaving foes dizzy and wondering whether they'd been outmaneuvered by a horse or a sorcerer. While arrows sang, the Mongols let fear do the heavy lifting, drumming a rhythm that sounded like the world's biggest bass drop. They lit firestorms that smelled of charred yak and burnt leather, a scent that stuck to the wind like a bad perfume. Scouts would scatter false banners, bright reds and blues, making the enemy think they faced an army the size of a continent. Night raids were accompanied by guttural war cries that echoed off the hills, turning the darkness into a living, snarling beast. Even after the riders vanished, the memory of that psychological onslaught lingers like the aftertaste of a too spicy dumpling. The Mongols didn't just ride. They carried a moving city in their saddlebags, complete with portable ovens that churned out steaming barley stew. Each horse was allotted a ration of dried yak meat and fermented mare's milk, a diet that could power a marathon runner and a warhorse simultaneously. They mapped waterholes like modern GPS, marking them with stone cairns that glowed in the moonlight, ensuring no cavalry ever ran dry. Their supply trains moved on camel back, humming "I Want It That Way." Okay, maybe not that song, but the rhythm of endless hooves was as catchy as any pop hit. This logistical wizardry meant that when the empire struck, it did so with the efficiency of a well-timed pizza delivery, hot and impossible to refuse. The hidden sword's edge never dulled. Its doctrines have been borrowed by generals who never rode a horse, from Napoleon's Grand Battery to modern drone swarms. History textbooks may gloss over the mud-splattered details, but the echo of Mongol thunder still rattles the halls of war rooms like a mischievous drum solo. Ironically, the very riders who forged the empire have long been reduced to skeletons in Siberian permafrost, yet their strategies sprint through our minds like a marathon meme. When you hear a distant thunderstorm on the steppe, remember it's not just weather, it's the ghost of flexible command, psychological shock, and supply line precision marching together. So raise a cup of fermented mare's milk, or a cold brew if you prefer, and toast the hidden sword that still slices through the fabric of conquest, proving that sometimes the sharpest weapons are the ideas we can't see. Under the bruised violet sky, young Bort crouches beside a crackling fire as the elder Jachai lifts his weather-worn voice. The old man rattles ancient oral histories that smell of dried yak cheese and fresh blood, binding the clan like a taut horse rope. Sparks jump upward, scattering like fireflies that have missed their cue for a nighttime rave. Bort watches his kin's eyes brighten and darken with each tale of triumph and tragedy, feeling the pulse of the steppe thrum in his chest. The scene feels like a live-action role play, but with no dice, only destiny. Beyond the glowing circle, the Eurasian steppe rolls infinite, a sea of amber grass that sways like a restless audience. A cold wind whistles through the herds, tossing specks of horse dung that sting the nose and remind everyone that glory smells like manure. Nomads ride on sturdy mares, their boots thudding against the soft earth, each hoofbeat a reminder that mobility is their armor. They drink from silvered streams that taste of iron, and their breath fogs in the chill, painting their faces with fleeting murals. In this open arena, survival means staying faster than a gossiping merchant in a bazaar. From the west, the rival tribe of the Karate drums a war cry that sounds oddly like a broken karaoke version of a rock ballad. Their banners flap like angry moths, casting shadows that threaten to steal the lush grazing patches Bort's clan depends on. The tension crackles louder than the fire, and someone mutters that the steppe is basically an endless episode of Survivor, with fewer cameras and more wolves. Irony drips from the scene. The very land that promises freedom also squeezes them into a competition for every patch of grass. Yet the Mongols grin, knowing that a good challenge makes a better story for future fireside recitals. Kinship runs through the steppe like a braided rope, each family link forged over shared meals of boiled mutton and fermented mare's milk that smells like sour socks. They exchange gifts, leather boots, a sturdy bow, a joke about how their ancestors probably invented the first meme. A painted goat skull with a witty caption. Resource quests turn into scavenger hunts where the prize is a fresh pasture or a hidden spring, and the losers get extra chores, like cleaning the stink-filled corrals. Humor eases the grind. A younger warrior once tried to ride a yak like a skateboard, only to be sent flying into a patch of thistles, earning a chorus of laughing howls. Through these trials, the clan learns that adaptability is their secret weapon, sharper than any curved saber. As night deepens, the fire dwindles to ember, and Jachai's voice softens, reminding Bort that the steppe will always test those who walk its plains. The distant rival horns fade, but the echo of competition remains, like a lingering bass line in a movie soundtrack. The clan rises, shoulders creaking, eyes glittering with the promise of tomorrow's raids and migrations. With a final gust of wind that carries the scent of wild thyme, Bort feels the primal urge to ride farther, to claim new horizons, and maybe, just maybe, to become the kind of legend that future generations will chant while roasting marshmallows. The open plains have spoken. Only the swift, the stubborn, and the slightly sarcastic survive. When the wind howls like a wounded wolf across the endless steppe, the frost turns the grass into a glittering carpet of ice. The clan huddles around smoky hearths, listening to the elder's voice crackling with the weight of a new law, the Yasa. Its words cut through the cold, promising gold for bravery and the shame of a broken oath. Even the air smells of horse sweat and pine resin, a reminder that nothing lives here without a mount to carry it. The Yasa declares that a rider who rides his horse into battle with fearless heart earns a silver bowl, while a lazy horse owner gets nothing but a cold night beside a dying fire. It codifies the sacred pact. A horse is not just a beast of burden but a brother in arms, its hooves beating like drums on the frozen ground. When a warrior slaps his steed's flank, the animal flinches, then snorts a plume of frosty breath, as if to say, "I got your back, even if you smell like yak cheese." The clan laughs because nothing feels more heroic than a warrior who can ride faster than a Netflix binge-watch marathon. But the Yasa also stirs trouble. Everyone suddenly thinks they're the next Genghis, and the cold makes tempers flare like sparklers in a snowstorm. Two chieftains argue over who should lead the next raid, hurling accusations louder than the gale that rattles their yurt doors. Their voices echo across the plains, mixing with the howl of wolves and the occasional squeak of a stray mouse gnawing on a leather boot. Irony bites. The very code meant to unite them now fuels a drama that would make even Game of Thrones reruns look tame. The brutal winter tests the Yasa's steel, forcing the clan to decide whether loyalty is a warm blanket or a cold steel blade. When a lone rider saves his comrades from an avalanche, he is praised with a ceremonial goat and a hearty slap on the back, the smell of roasted meat mingling with pine sap. The horses, shivering yet steadfast, stamp their hooves in rhythm, like a marching band of thunder that drives the cold away. The people realize that the bond between man and horse is their secret weapon, a living, breathing engine that can push them through snow deeper than any politician's promise. By the time the sun finally melts the ice, the Yasa stands firm, etched into every soul like a tattoo made of frost and fire. The clan gathers for a feast, the air thick with the aroma of fermented mare's milk and the sound of drums that mimic horse hooves. They toast to the code that turned their survival into legend, noting with a wink that even modern streaming services could learn a thing or two about staying loyal to their audience. In the end, the steppes' silence is broken not by war alone, but by the laughter of a people who know that when the world freezes, a brave heart and a sturdy steed can still blaze a trail. When the first thaw kisses the steppe, the air fills with the clatter of wheeled carts and the stench of yak dung that sticks to everything like an unwelcome souvenir. Traders from lands as far as the Caspian coast unfurl colorful blankets, revealing bright silks that glitter like a pop star's stage costume. Children dart between camels, shrieking as they dodge dust clouds that rise with each thunderous hoofbeat. The sun beats down, turning the grass into a sea of wavering gold, while the scent of roasted lamb drifts from makeshift ovens, promising a feast after a day of endless road song. Around cracked fire pits, the Mongol chieftains sip fermented mare's milk and shake hands, forearms, with neighboring clan leaders, sealing pacts that feel as sturdy as a fresh forged sword. They barter iron bars for raw silk, the metal clanging like distant drums while the silk slides through fingers with a whisper of distant palaces. A shrewd merchant jokes that the iron will build fortresses, while the silk will dress the warriors who storm them, earning a laugh that rolls across the steppe like a tumbleweed. The exchanges are swift, the smiles genuine, but underneath the camaraderie lies a calculating eye that measures every opportunity for expansion. Soon the campfires crackle with newer gossip, tales of cities beyond the Altai Mountains, where gold piles higher than a yurt's roof and spices perfume the air like incense in a dragon's lair. The rumors are carried on wind-blown scarves and the breath of weary travelers, each story more extravagant than the last. Some say towers that scrape the sky, others whisper of rivers that flow with liquid amber. The Mongols listen, their hearts thudding like war drums, as a young warrior imagines riding into those glittering streets on a horse that could outpace a sports car. Even the oldest elders, whose faces are carved with the map of countless battles, feel a tug of curiosity, a whisper that perhaps destiny is waiting just beyond the next ridge. But not everyone rejoices. Within the sprawling tented encampment, jealous factions stir like a simmering stew left too long on the fire, their murmurs growing louder than the distant howl of wolves. A disgruntled warlord, his beard tangled with ash, mutters about losing honor to trade pacts and foreign silk, fearing his clan's name will be reduced to a footnote in a merchant's ledger. He gathers a handful of loyalists, promising them glory and a share of any spoils, their eyes flickering with both fear and fierce ambition. The tension snaps like a bowstring pulled too tight, casting a shadow over the joyous spring revelry and reminding everyone that tradition can clash violently with new aspirations. As the sun dips behind the endless plains, the steppe hums with a paradoxical melody, traders' laughter mingling with the low growl of dissent, silk fluttering against the cold steel of swords. The Mongols stand at a crossroads, their blood hot with the promise of conquest, yet chilled by the scent of rebellion wafting through the night. In that moment, the steppe becomes a living character, breathing in the scent of fresh earth and exhaling stories of empires yet to be built. The journey ahead will be a dance between the old ways that keep their roots deep and the daring dreams that push them toward distant horizons, all under the watchful eye of a universe that seems to enjoy a good drama. When Genghis Khan lifted his arm, the wind over the endless steppe seemed to hold its breath. His voice cracked like a thunderclap, and the scattered clans fell into line as if drawn by an invisible magnet. The horizon rippled with dust and the scent of dry grass, while hooves beat a relentless rhythm that echoed across the plain. Every rider felt the electric charge of destiny in the air, a promise that the world would soon bend to their will. The horde, now a single organism, began its march toward legend. Mongol horsemanship was not a hobby, it was a birthright forged in the cradle of the steppe. Riders swapped saddles like Snapchat filters, swapping horses with the fluidity of a pop culture remix, each animal trained to turn on a whisper and dodge arrows like a video game avatar. Across the endless prairie, signal flags fluttered, fire torches winked, and a simple yelp could summon 100 riders faster than a pizza delivery on a Friday night. The scent of horse sweat mingled with the sharp bite of cold wind, while the thunder of hooves sounded like a drumline on steroids. This kinetic communication turned the horde into a living, breathing internet of war. At the heart of their conquest lay the Yasa, a legal code that prized ability over aristocracy, as if medieval Europe had adopted the "hire me if you need me" mantra of modern startups. No noble blood could excuse laziness. A low-born archer who could split an arrow could command 1,000 men. Discipline was enforced with a slap of a whip or a deadpan stare that could freeze a bull, making every soldier feel both terrified and oddly proud. The camp smelled of smoked yak meat and fresh leather, a constant reminder that merit paid for every morsel. This meritocracy turned the horde into a merit-based powerhouse that would make even Silicon Valley CEOs jealous. When the Mongols met rival armies, the clash sounded like a metal concert gone wrong, with clanging steel, guttural war cries, and the occasional squeal of a terrified warhorse. Opponents tried to form phalanxes, but the Mongol light cavalry sliced through them like a chef dicing onions, leaving a bitter, coppery perfume in the air. Even the most seasoned generals found their battle plans shredded faster than a cheap shirt in a laundry hurricane. The swift, disciplined raids left the enemy camps littered with broken shields, spilled wine, and the stale stench of panic. Watching it all, one could swear the steppe itself was cheering, its grasses rustling like an audience on edge. The siege of Khwarezm was the crowning act, a drama that turned the desert city into a furnace of smoke, shattered stone, and screaming goats. Mongol engineers hurled trebuchets that sang a low, ominous hum before flinging boulders that cracked walls like oversized popcorn kernels. Inside the city, the smell of burning incense mingled with the acrid bite of ash, while desperate defenders fanned flames with frantic desperation, as if trying to roast marshmallows over a battlefield. Genghis watched from a hilltop, his eyes glittering like a Netflix binge-watcher spotting the final season cliffhanger, knowing that his cultural engine horse, law and loyalty, had turned the impossible into a victory feast. As the last gate fell, the thunder of the horde rolled across the continent, echoing a promise that no empire could silence the steppe's relentless beat. When the Mongol banner unfurled across the steppe, it stretched from the salty breezes of the Pacific to the hazy sunsets over the Caspian. Riders thundered across grasslands, their hooves drumming like a tribal drumline that never missed a beat. The air smelled of horse sweat and burnt yak dung, a perfume that told the world the nomads were not just passing through. Yet every campfire crackle whispered a promise. This wandering world would soon wear a crown of cities. In that raw, wind-swept silence, the echo of 1,000 yurt voices began to shape a new order. They planted felt tents beside stone walls, trading barley for silk, while the clang of blacksmiths rang like a rock concert in the desert. Mongol warriors swapped battle cries for folk songs with Persian minstrels, stitching together a tapestry of lilting verses and guttural war chants. The marketplace roared with the hiss of frying lamb, the pungent tang of fermented mare's milk, and the glitter of jade trinkets slipping into fur-lined pockets. Even the local chefs learned to toss dumplings higher than a trebuchet, much to the amusement of generals who thought a good stew could win a siege. In this messy, fragrant mash-up, the steppe's nomadic ethos found a home among stone streets and glittering minarets. Language cracked open like a fresh pinecone, spilling Turkic, Chinese, and Arabic words onto the same dusty road. Courtiers scribbled poetry in calligraphy that looked like a dragon doing yoga, while caravan drivers taught their camels to nod along to the rhythm of Genghis's favorite drum beats. The empire's artists painted battle scenes with colors brighter than a Netflix thumbnail, and they laughed that a good mural could outshine any Instagram filter. A mischievous monk once tattooed a tiny horse on a diplomat's cheek, declaring, "Now you truly carry the steppe on your face." These cultural mash-ups proved that even a warrior's heart could skip a beat for a well-timed joke. Trade routes become the world's longest playlist, each stop dropping a fresh track of spices, stories, and scandal. The Silk Road hummed with the clatter of caravan wheels, the hiss of oil lamps, and the occasional gossip about a rival Khan's missing goat herd. Merchants swapped silk scarves for wooden toys, and the scent of cumin mingled with the acrid tang of gunpowder, a reminder that empire building could be both fragrant and explosively messy. Yet the wind never rested. It carried the distant echo of a shaman's throat singing into bustling bazaars, reminding everyone that the steppe spirit was still roaming free. In that chaotic chorus, the Mongols learned that power thrived not just on conquest, but on the sweet, sticky glue of shared culture. When the last great horse slipped into the annals of history, the steppe didn't turn into a quiet museum. It sprouted Wi-Fi towers that still broadcast the ghost of hooves across the internet. Modern tourists now snap selfies with ancient khanates, unaware that the same ground once smelled of yak urine and triumph. The empire's legacy flickers like a campfire in a snowstorm, bright, stubborn, and oddly comforting when you're lost. Historians joke that the Mongols were the original influencers, turning every corner of the world into a viral sensation before TikTok existed. And so, the echo on the steppe rolls on, a timeless soundtrack of wind, grit, and unstoppable curiosity. The sun rose over Kashgar like a sizzling skillet, and the scent of spiced lamb mingled with the sharp bite of horse urine in the caravan lanes. Batu Khan, a hulking Mongol with a beard that could hide a small goat, snapped his whip and shouted for the yurt of Rusby, the Persian merchant whose belly was as round as a merchant's ledger. Rusby, wiping a smear of kumis from his chin, unfurled a map that smelled faintly of frankincense and fear, promising riches beyond the Gobi's dunes. Together they loaded silk bolts, jade trinkets, and a crate of fermented camel milk onto a dozen sturdy steeds, ready to test the new empire's promise of safety on the open steppe. By the time the caravan slipped past the jagged horizons of the Altai, the Mongol banners fluttered like oversized flags on a medieval Netflix opening credits screen. Rumors whispered that Genghis heirs had stitched a massive peace treaty, Pax Mongolica, across the continent, turning the caravan routes into highways smoother than a silk sheet. At night, the wind sang a lullaby that made even the most jittery camel feel like it was being rocked in a rocking chair. Batu grinned, imagining traders sipping tea in Samarkand, without worrying about bandits popping up like surprise enemies in a video game. But peace, like a fragile teacup, cracks under a heavy foot. Near the oasis of Balkh, a rival warlord named Qutbuddin emerged, his men brandishing scimitars that glittered like disco lights. He demanded a toll, 3 camel hides and a sack of dates, claiming his own claim to the land. Batu laughed, slapping his sword against his thigh, and Rusby whispered a joke about paying the rent to the landlord of the steppe, while secretly sharpening his dagger under the heat of the desert sun. The tension hung thicker than the scent of burning incense, and the caravan held its breath, waiting for a showdown that could turn a trade route into a tumbleweed of blood. Just as the standoff threatened to explode, a fresh-faced Mongol scribe named Togrul arrived, clutching a scroll so crisp it crackled like fresh parchment in a library. He announced with the solemnity of a tech support agent that the empire's new administration had issued an edict. All merchants shall enjoy safe passage, unless you're trying to smuggle illegal yak cheese. The irony was palpable. The bureaucracy was as new as a newborn foal stumbling over its own legs. Batu, ever the pragmatic warrior, accepted the decree, while Rusby whispered that the real danger now lay in paperwork that smelled like ink and goat droppings. The rival warlord, confused by the sudden paperwork shuffle, grumbled and retreated, muttering something about these Mongols and their fancy pens. With the dust settling, the caravan roared back onto the road, its wheels turning like a Spotify playlist of desert beats. Batu glanced at Rusby, who was now polishing a golden coin that reflected the sky like a tiny sun. "We're writing the first episode of a global drama," Batu joked, "and I'm the lead actor, you're the witty sidekick, and the Mongols are the producers who keep cutting commercials." The steppe stretched out, endless and humming with the promise of trade, adventure, and occasional camel flatulence. As they vanished beyond the horizon, the markets of Kashgar whispered a new chant. "May the silk flow, may the danger be low, and may the Empire's Wi-Fi, call it the Pax Mongolica, never drop." The sun rose like a molten coin tossed onto the dunes, and Batu's caravan lumbered into the western desert with a creak of wooden wheels and the sigh of tired camels. Heat hung in the air so thick you could slice it with a sword, and every breath tasted of iron and sand. Rusby, the caravan's savvy quartermaster, swatted at a buzzing sandfly that smelled suspiciously of old cheese, muttering that even the insects were trying to sell him a better deal. In the distance, the dunes stretched like the back of a giant sea monster, promising both riches and ruin. The crew tightened their scarves, knowing the desert would test any promise of glory with a blistering grin. Midday brought a sandstorm that roared louder than a Mongol war drum, slamming the sky with a curtain of grit that stung eyes and choked throats. The wind howled like a disgruntled wolf, ripping at the tents and turning trade jars into airborne projectiles. Some even rolled past the caravan like tiny, angry bowling balls. Batu shouted orders over the din, his voice barely a whisper against the chaos, while Rusby tried to barter with a stray goat for a dry cloak, only to have it spit out a mouthful of sand. When the storm finally passed, a ghostly silence lingered, broken only by the clink of shattered ceramic and the lingering scent of ozone mixed with burnt incense. The survivors emerged, covered in a fine layer of dust that glittered like cheap sequins, laughing nervously like actors who just realized they'd missed their cue. Just as the dust settled, a band of rebel nomads appeared over the next dune, their horses snorting and eyes flashing with the kind of fury reserved for unpaid bills. They wore patched cloaks and carried bows that sang with each release, muttering curses at the Mongol tax collectors who had once tried to squeeze a ducat out of every caravan. Batu stepped forward, hands raised in peace, and offered a sack of dried apricots, an offering as awkward as a Kardashian selfie at a tea ceremony. Negotiations turned into a heated barter, with the rebels demanding water rights and safe passage, while Rusby countered with exotic spices and a promise of future tribute. The air crackled with tension, humor, and the faint smell of fear, as both sides realized a showdown could end in either bloodshed or a surprisingly courteous exchange of snacks. When the sun dipped low, turning the sand into a pool of melted gold, the rebels finally relented, but only after a brief scuffle over the last barrel of water. Camels kicked, hooves thudded, and a stray spear found its way into a trader's sandal, prompting an exclamation that sounded like a medieval meme. Whoa, talk about a wet foot! Rusby, ever the improviser, slipped a handful of cumin into the rebels' throats, claiming it would keep the desert breath fresh. a joke that earned a reluctant grin and a cracked grin from the chief. The fight settled into a chaotic dance of sloshing barrels, shouted curses, and the occasional giggle as someone slipped on a puddle of spilled wine. By nightfall, the caravan had secured enough water to last a full day, and the rebels, satisfied with their spoils, disappeared into the darkness like a plot twist in a binge-watch series. The desert settled back into its quiet, waiting for the next drama to unfold. As the caravan trekked onward, rumors fluttered through the camp like desert moths about a distant court in Karakoram, where Genghis' great-grandson held feasts that could make the gods jealous. Some whispered that the emperor himself would bless travelers with gold, while others muttered that the court was a mirage, a fancy Instagram filter on a bleak reality. Batu smiled wryly, recalling a tale of a boy who thought he could ride a dragon, only to end up on a donkey with a broken saddle. The hope of riches tugged at his heart like a mischievous sprite, yet the fear of betrayal lingered, as palpable as the sour scent of a dead rat near the well. With a final gulp of water and a glance at the star-spattered sky, the caravan pressed on, ready to write the next chapter of sand, steel, and stubborn optimism. The caravan crested the wind-scarred steppe and saw Karakoram glitter like a desert mirage. Their camels stamped dust onto the polished stone path leading to the great Khan's palace, where banners fluttered like multicolored fish in a river of fire. Inside, marble columns rose as tall as a giraffe, and incense rose thick, tasting of cumin and yak butter. The travelers gulped the scented air, feeling both humbled and oddly like extras in a Hollywood epic. Think Game of Thrones meets the Grand Budapest Hotel. They exchanged nervous glances, wondering whether the palace's golden doors would open for merchants or for a marching band of Mongol drummers. At the great hall, a chorus of tongues collided: Persian, Chinese, Arabic, and the guttural Mongol growls of the Khan's grandson, Urjadei-II, who boasted a beard as tangled as a spaghetti monster. A sly Persian envoy slicked his turban with oil, whispering jokes about a silk road Uber that would deliver silk faster than a horse mail. A Chinese silk weaver, clutching bolts that shimmered like captured moonlight, tried to explain the delicate art of weaving to a curious Mongol child who kept poking the fabric with a stick. Meanwhile, a Levantan spice merchant coughed up a cloud of sumac dust, making the whole assembly sneeze in perfect unison, a chorus of accidental applause. The court's multilingual banter turned the hall into a circus of accents, each word a tightrope walker balancing respect and rivalry. The atmosphere shifted when the Grand Vizier of the Chinese tributary, a man with a scar shaped like a dragon, slammed a sealed parchment on the marble table. He declared a new silk tariff. Every bolt would now carry a tax as hefty as a yak's hooves, a move that made the Levantan merchants' eyes widen like surprised cats. Urjadei-II huffed, his laughter bubbling into a snort, saying, "You try to tax the clouds. Good luck catching them with a net." The Levantan ambassador, wearing a robe embroidered with tiny pomegranates, retorted that the Mongols themselves had taxed the winds when they forced traders to ride through the desert without water, an irony sharper than a scimitar. The debate crescendoed, echoing off the palace walls like a drumbeat in a soundtrack for a medieval rap battle. Tension crackled, and the courtyard's horses pawed at the ground, snorting dust that smelled like burnt pine and stale kebabs. Merchants whispered that if the tariff held, silk would stop flowing and the empire's famous silk sofa, the soft, shimmering carpets that lined the Khan's throne would become as threadbare as a sitcom laugh track. A cheeky Mongol boy slipped a raw egg onto the vizier's sandal, causing a squelching slip that sent the vizier sliding across the polished floor, the egg cracking like a surprise pop-up. Laughter burst from the courtiers, breaking the ice faster than a Netflix binge watch, and even the stern Grand Khan's advisor cracked a grin, muttering that perhaps a little chaos was the best trade spice. Yet beneath the jokes, the stakes remained as heavy as a caravan's load of jade. The whole Silk Road could stall, leaving merchants starving like bears in a honeyless hive. In a sudden flash of diplomacy, the great Khan's mother, a matriarch with eyes like polished obsidian, rose from her throne and brandished a ruby-studded scroll. She declared a compromise. A modest tax, but only if the Levantan traders agreed to send a troop of troubadours to entertain the court each spring, a deal that felt like trading a rare Pokémon for a mixtape. The merchants, relieved, clapped their hands, the sound echoing like 100 cymbals, while the Chinese silk weaver bowed, his silk now shimmering with a new story. As the caravan prepared to depart, the scent of spiced tea mingled with the smoky perfume of horse dung, reminding everyone that greatness is never spotless. With a final salute, Urjade II raised his hand, winking and saying, "May your silks glide smoother than a Jedi's lightsaber through the night sky," and the caravan rolled away, their camels humming a low, contented grunt. The sun blistered the terracotta roofs of Samarkand as a caravan of merchants piled their spices, silks, and half-rotten dates into the marketplace. A shouted accusation cracked through the heat when a Mongol tax collector tried to seize a box of prized rose water without a receipt. Voices rose like a kettle about to boil, and soon the market erupted into a shouting match that smelled of sweat, incense, and fresh horse manure. Batu, the grim-eyed commander of the Golden Horde's western wing, heard the clamor from his tent and tightened his leather gauntlets. He knew that a single spark here could scorch the entire Silk Road, a fact that felt as heavy as a sack of gold on his shoulders. He rode out on a galloping mare, the hooves clattering like drums of war across the cobblestones. Behind him, a ragtag band of armored guards swayed, their helmets glinting like busted tick-tock lights in the noon glare. The merchants, clutching ledgers and prayer beads, formed a human barricade, shouting curses in Persian that sounded like a broken karaoke track. Batu raised his sword, its blade catching the sun and flashing a warning that even the desert lizards seemed to pause and stare. Yet the crowd's fury roared louder than any battle cry, a thundering tide of sandalwood perfume and angry shouts. Just as the tension thickened like cold porridge, Rusby, a lanky scholar with a beard that could hide a camel, stepped forward, clutching a weather-worn scroll of poetry. He whispered verses of Hafiz, letting the lilting couplets drift over the crowd like honeyed wind, softening the edge of anger. The merchants paused, their eyes flickering between the poem and the gleaming swords, as the scent of burning incense mixed with the tang of blood from a wounded guard. Rusby's voice rose, even the fiercest storm bows before the rhyme of love, an irony that made a few grizzled Mongols snort in disbelief, as if hearing a dad joke at a medieval banquet. Slowly, the crowd's clamor dulled, replaced by a murmuring hush that seemed to wrap Samarkand in a blanket of uneasy peace. Batu, however, was not a fan of poetic ceasefires and barked an order for his men to secure the market stalls. The guards formed a tight circle, swords flashing, while the merchants backed away, their faces smeared with dust and sweat like a misplaced makeup tutorial. A skirmish sparked when a young apprentice tried to wrest a confiscated crate of silk, the cloth ripping with a sound that reminded everyone of a vintage vinyl record scratching. The clash erupted into a chaotic dance of steel and spice, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sweet aroma of cinnamon, a truly sensory overload. Through it all, Rusby continued to recite, his words now a metronome that kept the battle from spiraling into outright carnage. When the dust settled, Batu stood amid a tableau of bruised shoulders, trampled carpets, and a half-eaten lamb that had rolled onto the sand. He looked to Rusby, whose poetic chant had stopped at the final line, and thus the road is safe as long as hearts beat in rhythm. With a grudging nod, Batu declared a new edict. Merchants could trade freely, provided they paid a modest tribute that sounded more like a friendly tip than a ransom. The crowd erupted in tentative applause, the sound like clinking teacups in a modern coffee shop, oddly familiar, oddly hopeful. As the sun dipped behind the distant Pamir peaks, the Silk Road breathed a sigh of relief, its lifeblood renewed by a blend of steel, stanza, and a dash of unexpected humor. The desert sun rose like a hot plate, roasting the canvas of the caravan as it licked the ancient dunes. Merchants tightened their satchels, the scent of camel sweat mingling with the sweet perfume of silk bundles. A nervous jester like Trader cracked a joke about how the Mongols must have invented the first Uber, just point, and a horse shows up, while the drumbeats of distant gongs whispered of peace restored. With the clatter of wheels and hooves, the line of wagons set off again, their cargo humming with the promise of distant markets. Crossing the pine-scented foothills of the Altai, the caravan encountered a troop of wandering monks chanting in a language that sounded like a medieval rap battle. The monks tossed spices, cumin, cardamom, a dash of chilies, into the air, creating a fragrant cloud that made the camels' nostrils twitch in delighted confusion. A young porter, cheeks flushed from the heat, tried to barter a piece of silk for a story, only to receive a bewildering tale about a dragon that loved tea. Laughter rippled through the wagons like a wind chime, turning the arduous trek into a moving festival of smells and sounds. At the bustling markets of Samarkand, the caravan's arrival sparked fireworks of color, bright rugs like giant patchwork quilts and lanterns that flickered like fireflies trapped in glass. Buyers hawked their wares, their voices a chorus of haggling that rose and fell like a drum solo in a rock concert. A shrewd Persian merchant swapped a bolt of opulent silk for a scroll of poetry, whispering, "Your verses travel faster than any horse." The air grew thick with incense, roasting meat, and the faint, acrid bite of melted lead from scribes' inkwells, a reminder that ideas, like metal, must sometimes be forged under pressure. The caravan pressed westward, the landscape turning from arid plains to the humid, bustling streets of Constantinople, where the Bosphorus sang a salty lullaby. Here, the scent of fresh baklava competed with the earthy musk of horses, while minstrels played melodies that sounded suspiciously like a medieval mixtape. A bold Armenian trader tried to convince a Byzantine noble that the silk they carried was the original cashmere, a joke that earned a chuckle and a raised eyebrow, because cashmere actually comes from goats, not cash registers. The caravan's horses snorted at the crowd's exotic chatter, their hooves echoing on marble, sealing the bond between east and west with each clop. When the last caravan flag dipped in the cool twilight of Venice, the city's canals reflected a tapestry of lantern light, as if the heavens were stitching together the worlds the traders had crossed. The silk unfurled like a river of moonlight, the spices crackled like a dragon's sneeze, and the ideas exchanged, astronomy, medicine, poetry, floated on the salty breeze. A tired but smiling caravan leader raised his cup of spiced wine and toasted, to the road that turned war into a global group chat. The cheers that rose were the true legacy of the Mongol-kept Silk Road, a thread of trade that tied humanity together, weaving a new era where every whisper carried the echo of distant lands.